Good afternoon, and welcome to Roosevelt House Online. My name is Jessica Newworth, and I am the Rita E. Hauser Director of the Human Rights Program here at Hunter College. As we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations this year, I think Eleanor Roosevelt would be very pleased that we are helping the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights publicly launch her report on climate change and cultural extinction. The existential danger of climate change is one of the most urgent human rights issues of our time, and understanding it in a holistic way will no doubt better equip us to address it strategically and effectively. I want to thank Karima Benoon, the Special Rapporteur, for organizing this online event with us, and I want to welcome our distinguished panelists. I will leave it to our moderator to introduce the panelists and just want to say that it's a great honor to have Mary Robinson, former President and former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, joining us today. And now it's my pleasure to thank and introduce our moderator, Stephanie Ferrier, distinguished lecturer here at Hunter College with a very distinguished career in human rights, spanning 25 years of teaching, scholarship, and advocacy. I want to thank Stephanie and the staff of our human rights program, Katrina Avila and Hector Perez, as well as Danny Culkin, for putting together all the logistics of this event. And now I'm very happy to give the floor to Stephanie Ferrier. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. And thanks everyone for joining us. We have over 400 participants from around the world who are watching this webinar. And it's very exciting to be able to do this through the magic of the virtual world we are currently in. Just a few details about how we're going to run the webinar. The chat feature is not enabled for the webinar, so that won't be open. I'll be using it to send some links to the Special Rapporteur's report and a few other bits of information. But what will be open is the question feature. So if you want to pose questions, you can send them. We'll get to questions then during the Q&A period toward the end. We'll go through them and we'll have some time to address questions. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted both on the United Nations website of the Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights and also on the Roosevelt House website. So those of you who want to see it again or share it with others, you'll be able to see the recording. We are encouraging people to live tweet the event if you want to, and I will be sending around in the chat the hashtag, it's hashtag climate culture to live tweet. Well, we're going to begin with a heartfelt message from a frontline defender, Mohammed Hizyam. He's 16 years old. He's the school captain of Sinu Atoll School and a member of the NGO Mulimata United, working for community empowerment. He's working against climate change in the city of Adu, the town of Midu in the Maldives. And now his video message to us.
Assalamu alaikum. Greetings all. I'm Mohammed Hizyam, 16 years of age, living in the small island nation of the Maldives. I'm from the southernmost atoll of the Maldives, the city of Adu. My island, Saint Midu, has been a beacon of knowledge and cultivation for hundreds of Maldivian Islamic scholars and philosophers. We have a centuries-old cemetery where great scholars are resting, and Midu is a place of historical significance in the Maldives. Over the past few years, climate change and global warming has threatened our existence. Our country is the lowest-lying nation with an average elevation of just 4 feet above sea level. With sea levels constantly rising, not only the tourism sector, which runs our economy, but also the culture and heritage of this country with white sandy beaches are at high risk. For instance, the shoreline of Midu has been eroded by more than 50 feet over the past decade, and it still continues to do so. Some estimates suggest that the rising sea levels have already engulfed over 100 feet of shoreline in the past 50 to 60 years. Undoubtedly, this is jeopardizing our cultural identity. Our most valued cultural heritage is the centuries-old cemetery, as I have mentioned before, locally known as the Kogarnoga Burustan. Written history shows that the people who brought the light of Islam to Medu are buried in the cemetery along with the royals who once ruled the islands of the Maldives. Its significance is truly the history behind it and the love we have for the deed. It is with heavy heart that I say this, but as of 2020, there are approximately only 20 feet between the current shoreline and this historical antique. If no actions are taken soon, undeniably a rich historical masterpiece would just be washed away into the unknown. Not only that, but the British colonial historical remnants present in Naddo City are one of the key significant monuments in our cultural identity. The concrete remains of World War II battery still stands in the northern east point of Medu, which in the past was land. However, 50 feet have been eroded and it is fully submerged during high tide. An outsider might even say that it does not even exist. Piece by piece, our identity is being dripped into the depths of the sea. If these tragic events still continue, I wonder whether we'll have anything left to pass on our cultural identity to the future generations. I, as a student and as someone concerned about the environmental crisis, strongly refuse to be relocated to foreign land to be labeled as refugees with no identities. My cultural identity is conspicuously important as yours and everyone's. It is high time that the international community commence to reflect on the issue of climate change and rising sea levels on a much larger scale. We matter. We have a voice. We are the children of the sea. The sea provides for us, but it is equally unforgiving. Please hear our voice and take action before a piece of culture from the world gets engulfed. दुनिया हुणु मैं देखड़ा एम्में गुलिकें और बड़ा शुक्रिया.
Thank you so much, Mohammed Hiziam, for this powerful, powerful message you have shared with us. It is now my pleasure to introduce the co-convener of this webinar and the author of the report that inspired this event, UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, Professor Karima Benoon. Professor Benoon has been the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights since 2015. She's a longtime advocate and author in this field of human rights, and she's a professor of law and holds the Frank Angelo and Ann Berryhill Endowed Chair in International Law at the University of California, Davis School of Law. Professor Benoon, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Professor Ferrier. Greetings to everyone participating in this meeting and my warm cultural solidarity to all of us in these challenging times. I'd like to thank Roosevelt House for co-hosting this event and Katrina Avia for her work on it, and especially Professor Stephanie Ferrier, a leading global expert on human rights, for the excellent collaboration on this project and many others. I'm grateful to all the panelists and especially appreciative of our distinguished keynote commentator, Mrs. Mary Robinson, for making time to share her insights. We gather today in cyberspace to discuss the somber topic of climate change and cultural extinction, a human rights crisis, and to address the related themes of my report for the General Assembly. I'll present the report to the GA tomorrow at 3 p.m. New York time, and you can watch live on webtv.un.org. In our time together, I'd like us all to enhance our understanding of the challenges, but also to brainstorm about what we may do about them. As our speaker from Tuvalu rightly insisted to me, there has been so much discussion. Now we need action. So I would ask everyone during the event to write down at least one thing you plan to do to follow up, whether it's to read the report and the annex and circulate these documents, to lobby your government to support their recommendations, to live tweet the interactive dialogue so we can hold governments accountable for what they say and don't say, to support one of the groups working on these issues, such as the Climate Heritage Mobilization, or something entirely different. In any case, I hope we will approach our subject matter, however concerning, with a spirit of urgent optimism, remembering the words of Berta Cáceres, the slain Honduran indigenous rights defender, who said, "Let us come together and remain hopeful as we defend and care for the blood of this earth and its spirit." With all that in mind, let me summarize a few of the report's key messages. Urgent action on climate change is needed to protect the cultures and cultural rights of billions of people around the world and to avoid the cultural extinction of the most vulnerable. As an official in Tuvalu asked me during my mission to his country, if we are not here anymore, what will happen to our culture? Even during the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate emergency remains one of the greatest threats humanity has ever faced and is the leading global threat to cultural rights. It must be addressed with urgency. The negative impacts of climate change on human cultures and on the enjoyment by all of their internationally guaranteed cultural rights must be placed on the international agenda. This is equally true of the positive potential of our cultures and the exercise of our cultural rights to serve as critical tools in our response to the climate emergency. We need a tripartite integration of environmental, cultural, and human rights perspectives on climate change in policy and expertise, and the creation of channels of communication and cooperation between policymakers and civil society in all three areas. Given the shortness of time, I wish to emphasize three main points. First, let me stress the scale of the threat the climate emergency poses to cultures. While most human rights are affected by climate change, cultural rights are particularly drastically affected in that they risk being simply wiped out in many cases. We may lose centuries of human cultural achievement, many of the cultural and heritage sites and practices that people hold most dear, and even entire ways of life. Movement away from homelands may result in staggering cultural losses, which deprive people already suffering from other severe impacts of a key resource for resilience and memory. These realities have not been adequately acknowledged in current climate change initiatives. They must be recognized as a matter of international legal obligation and addressed as a priority. Adequate analysis and documentation, including a complete mapping of cultural and cultural heritage damage, and the development of comprehensive strategies for preventing and responding to it, are essential tasks going forward. These effects on cultural rights are already visible. You have heard the moving message from the 16-year-old Maldivian activist Mohammed Hizyam, who I met during my mission to his country. As we visited the at-risk heritage sites that you saw in the video, he said to me, "I fear for my country. I fear for the survival of my country. No one, least of all a young person, should have to face such fears." While the climate emergency threatens humanity in its entirety and all human cultures, and I cannot stress that enough, the impacts also hit specific peoples and places disproportionately, posing particular threats to the cultures of populations living in vulnerable environments, such as small island developing states, the Sahel, or the Arctic, as well as persons with disabilities and youth. Women and girls already face many obstacles to the enjoyment of their cultural rights, and climate change worsens these inequalities, including in accessing education. Climate change-induced destruction of cultural heritage has particularly significant effects on Indigenous peoples, for whom connections to land and ecosystems play such an important role. We must be committed to climate culture justice, as those most affected by climate change, and who have often done the least to contribute to it, have fewer resources to protect their cultures from its effects. This could result in much of the cultural traces of the biggest victims of climate change being allowed to disappear, while the histories of those most responsible are more protected. This is unacceptable. And in this 75th anniversary year, we must recognize this to be a clear violation of the spirit of the UN Charter itself. We cannot be passive observers of cultural extinction. International cooperation and funding, partnered with local empowerment and participation, are essential to ensure this does not occur. I call on the international community to adopt a human rights-based global action plan to save the cultures of humanity and protect cultural rights from the climate emergency, prioritizing prevention of the cultural extinction of populations living in the most vulnerable environments. My second major point is that even as they are under threat, cultural rights and cultural resources, including traditional knowledge, are powerful allies in the battle against climate change. Arts and culture are vital avenues for sharing information and mobilizing people and should be more fully integrated into climate action. Cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and creativity are climate assets and should be recognized as such. Culture and cultural rights have inherent value. However, we must now also recognize their tremendous utility in our existential fight against climate change. This means we have yet one more reason to take cultures seriously, to protect cultural heritage and ensure cultural rights. Without them, we are at even greater risk in our warming world. My third main point is that sweeping, rights-respecting cultural change will be necessary to alter the trajectory of climate change. The status quo is unsustainable. Since culture is not static, such change, if carried out in line with human rights standards, is a part of the enjoyment of cultural rights. For example, work towards cultures of gender equality and youth empowerment is vital for improving climate change response. Moreover, we must now make the choices and changes needed to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius target and fully embrace the value of our own human and cultural survival above profits and short-term convenience. Let us never forget that the threat to humanity and its cultures is much greater for 2 degrees Celsius of global warming than for 1.5 degrees Celsius. We must do nothing less than reimagine the culture of our relationship with nature to meet that target. The current pandemic has shown that waiting to respond to risk until the risk has fully materialized is a deadly strategy which magnifies unbearable losses. Aspirational words, including my own, are insufficient. Rapid, effective action now by all of us is essential. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bernoun, for shining such a bright light on these issues and coming at it with a very action-oriented approach in your mandate. It is now my distinct honor to introduce a very special guest who will present the keynote remarks for our event, Mary Robinson. Mary Robinson is Adjunct Professor for Climate Justice at Trinity College Dublin and Chair of the Elders. She served as President of Ireland from 1990 to 1997 and as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 1997 to 2002. She is a member of the Club of Madrid and the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Barack Obama. Between 2013 and 2016, Mrs. Robinson served as a UN Secretary General's Special Envoy in 3 roles. First for the Great Lakes region of Africa, then on climate change, and most recently as Special Envoy on El Nino and climate. Her foundation, the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice, established in 2010, came to a planned end in April of 2019. Mrs. Robinson is also former president of the International Commission of Jurists, former chair of the Council of Women World Leaders, and was president and founder of Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative from 2002 to 2010, and served as honorary president of Oxfam International for 10 years. Her memoir, which I encourage you all to read, Everybody Matters, is published in 2012, and her book, Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience, and the Fight for a Sustainable Future, was published in 2018. We are deeply honored. Looking forward to hearing your remarks. Mrs. Robinson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And if I may, I'm so enthusiastic about this report. I want you to come in and stop me. I know I've been given 10 minutes, which is a lot in the circumstances, but I'm so enthusiastic, I'll probably overrun. So don't hesitate when the time comes to stop me. And I'm really pleased to take part in this discussion on cultural rights and human rights based on Karina's report to the UN, which she has just eloquently introduced. Needless to say, I'm particularly happy with the way the report brings home the devastating impact of climate change already on the cultures and the cultural heritages of all people, and therefore on the related human rights of billions around the world. What I like is how Karima focuses on a very people-centered approach with her stories of her visits to the Maldives and to Tuvalu, and indeed the wonderful and very sad video from young Mohammed Hijam. This is a climate justice approach, which I very much approve of. And I just want to take the opportunity to mention the 5 layers of climate justice, which I've now identified and work with. And the first is the disproportionate impact on the poorest countries, the poorest communities, the small island states, the indigenous peoples who are least responsible and yet are suffering disproportionately. Secondly, there is the gender dimension, and that has been brought out very well by Karima, and I want to come back to it in her report, that it disproportionately affects women. The third layer is the intergenerational injustice, and actually Karima also touches on this, as I'll come back to. But I'm so glad that children around the world are speaking out so well and so clearly and holding governments to account and not being happy with half measures or, you know, sort of UN speak about this. No, they are looking at the science and telling us we have to do far more. The fourth injustice is a subtle one, but I want to just lay it out here. The injustice of the pathways to development. The industrialized world, we built our economies on fossil fuel, and now we have to wean ourselves off. I was the special envoy, as was mentioned, of the Secretary General before the Paris Agreement on climate. And I watched as developing countries, one after the other, wanted to go as green as possible in their nationally determined contributions. But they said, we will need the investment, we will need the training, we will need the skills if we're going to do this. And we haven't seen that solidarity. And meanwhile, developing countries have found oil and gas and coal in their countries. What are they to do? They have to bring their people out of poverty. If they do so, they will be the first affected because of the disproportionate impact on the poorest countries, but we will all suffer because it will use up the carbon budget. And that's something we need to think about. And the fifth injustice, of course, is the injustice to nature herself, the loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species. So now back to Karima's excellent report. I want to mention in particular the gender dimensions, and I want to quote a little bit because she uses language very well, as we heard from her summary. She says about gender, she says, susceptibility to climate impacts and disasters is gendered, with women facing higher vulnerability to casualties, often due to factors related to culture, such as inability to swim, clothing that restricts mobility, and culturally assigned gender roles. Climate change magnifies existing gender inequalities between girls and boys and raises culture-related obstacles for girls, including increased difficulty accessing education. And frankly, COVID has made that much worse. Girls are being driven in their millions, I'm sorry to say, into early child marriage, something we were trying to get on top of. But what she ends that paragraph with, paragraph 8, is that women are catalysts for climate change activism and play a leading role in creating culture anew and driving new ways to adapt to the climate crisis. So it's that balance. Yes, women are more victims because they lack power, because of other cultural constraints, but they are, and that's what my book on climate justice spoke about, they are the activists for change in their communities. They are building the resilience. And then she goes on in paragraph 9 to say, climate change is the most significant intergenerational equity issue of our time. Children and future generations are bearing, or will come to bear, the brunt of its impact in a polluted, degraded planet. And I want to go on to paragraph 21, where Karima mentioned something that she touched on, so I want to echo her, because it's important and it's thoughtful. She analyzes that many environmental policies don't address culture, while many cultural policies don't refer to the environment. And both sets of policies may fail to incorporate a human rights approach. And she says what is needed is a tripartite integration of environmental, culture, and human rights approaches on climate change in policy and expertise at the international, regional, national, and local levels, and the creation of channels of communication and of institutionalized cooperation between policymakers, officials, government agencies, international organizations, experts, and civil society groups in all three areas. I couldn't agree more. It was a very thoughtful point. Another one, which I was delighted to see and not surprised in a report on the cultural dimensions, was about climate displacement. And that's paragraph 43. She says, climate displacement threatens cultural survival itself and jeopardizes traditional livelihoods. And that's the point about the Maldives and Tuvalu. My foundation, we worked on climate displacement, and we told the stories that this will be whole communities who will have to move. And at paragraph 44, she urges that creative ways to respect, protect, ensure, and fulfill the cultural rights of persons who become displaced in the context of disasters and climate change must be developed. Climate rights are a primordial component of migration with dignity. This will also require innovative approaches to recognizing and allowing space for expression and preservation of the collective identities and shared cultures of large groups which may be displaced, including entire national populations. And this is what we talked about in the foundation, the stories that grandparents have to tell their grandchildren, the way in which, you know, indigenous peoples have to realize they leave the land of the bones of their ancestors. And I'm kind of wondering whether I'm going to be spending too much time. So I want to just refer to the recommendations, and I'm going to end with these and hope I'm still within my 10 minutes. I'm going to talk about recommendations S and T, and I'm going to read them. We have to ensure gender mainstreaming throughout all climate targets and climate actions, prioritizing the education of women and girls, improving gender disaggregated data, including with regard to culture-related climate impacts, and equalizing care burdens, and recognizing gender differences in adaptation needs, opportunities, and capacities in the cultural area. And T is advocate for strong property rights for women and Indigenous peoples in line with relevant international standards. So you can tell, as somebody who's been embracing climate justice for a long time, this report is a key one. I wish it had come out earlier. I could have used it with my foundation more actively, but I will use it as chair of the elders. I will use it in my work. I will refer to it frequently. And thank you, Karima, for such a good report. I can't tell you how strongly I endorse everything in it and more.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Robinson, for this, as always, insightful and powerful and inspiring remarks as well. And for your overall leadership and advocacy in human rights. Thank you so much. It is now my great pleasure to introduce David Boyd, our next speaker. Dr. David Boyd is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. He's a professor at University of British Columbia and the author of 10 books, including The Environmental Rights Revolution, The Rights of Nature, and The Optimistic Environmentalist. We all need some optimism in all this. So Dr. Boyd, I understand that during your time as Special Rapporteur, you have witnessed the connections between climate change and cultural rights on a number of occasions, and we look forward to hearing more about them. Dr. Boyd, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And let me just say it's both an honor and somewhat daunting to follow in the footsteps of one of my heroes, and certainly a hero for the planet, Mary Robinson. So thank you for those comments, Mary. And really, I want to start by thanking Professor Karima Bennoune for her powerful, compelling, and inspiring report on the relationship between climate change and culture. My first report to the General Assembly was presented last year, and it dealt with climate change and human rights, and is entirely consistent with the recommendations and the conclusions that Karima has reached in her report. But I think it's actually very powerful that there's a growing chorus of voices from the United Nations Special Procedures. Karima's report is the latest in a series of reports by special rapporteurs on climate change and specific aspects of human rights, including reports by the special rapporteurs on extreme poverty, on food, on the rights of Indigenous peoples, on the rights of migrants, on the rights of internally displaced peoples, and more. And I think this shows just how comprehensive the impacts of the global climate emergency are on the whole range of human rights. As Stephanie mentioned, I've had the great pleasure and honor of doing several country missions since I became the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment in 2018. My first country visit was to Fiji, which, as all of you would, as you would imagine, is really a beautiful tropical paradise, populated by some of the world's most generous and friendly people. But Fiji is on the front lines of the climate crisis. I visited a small village called Vunidogoloa, which is one of the first communities in the world that had to be completely relocated because of climate change, because of rising sea levels, storm surges, and saltwater contamination of their water supply and their agricultural lands. Now, Fiji is actually more fortunate than some other island nations in that it does have land at higher elevations. And so the community of Vunidogoloa was relocated approximately 3 kilometers inland. So I visited the old village site and the new village site. But of course, the disruption and the impacts of culture, of having to uproot your community, are really terrible. And it was very powerful to witness. I spoke with several older people in the community who grew up beside the ocean, whose lives, whose livelihoods, whose food, whose cultures are centered on the ocean. And they simply cannot walk the 3 kilometers of a steep trail in the blazing heat and humidity. And so they are separated from the ocean that has given them sustenance and been the root of their culture. Very difficult to see, difficult to witness. And Vunidogoloa is the first of more than 50 Fijian villages that is going to have to be relocated. My second trip as a special rapporteur was to Norway. Really, I wanted to visit the other end of the spectrum, a major oil and gas producer. But while I was in Norway, I visited with the Sami indigenous people north of the Arctic Circle, whose livelihoods and whose culture are based on reindeer herding. And here again, climate change is disrupting their culture. You know, the reindeer during the winter months for thousands of years have been able to use their hoofs to scrape away the snow to access the mosses and lichens that give them sustenance through the winter months. But because of climate change, they're now getting intermittent snow and rainfall and melting of the snow. And so layers of ice are forming that they've never experienced. And their hooves simply cannot scrape away the ice to get at the foods. And so reindeer are starving en masse in northern Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Russia, with devastating consequences for the Sami people. And I'm a Canadian. I live on the west coast of Canada, where wild salmon are the beating heart of Indigenous cultures and are enduring an absolutely catastrophic population collapse, primarily because of climate change. And this is just absolutely devastating to the First Nations of British Columbia. And so you look at these experiences and you think, why aren't nations taking the urgent actions needed? We know what the solutions are. Countries of the world came together in 1992, negotiated the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Then we had the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. But here's one statistic to take away with you today. In 1992, when nations negotiated the Framework Convention on Climate Change, 81% of the world's energy supply came from fossil fuels, from coal, oil, and natural gas. 27 years later, the proportion of the world's energy supply coming from fossil fuels is still 81%. This is a devastating indictment of the failure of nations to address the climate crisis. And at the root of the problem is the fact that these international environmental instruments don't have any enforcement mechanisms. There's no way to hold nations accountable under the Framework Convention or the Paris Agreement. And that's where human rights have such a critical role to play in addressing the climate crisis, because there are mechanisms for enforcing people's human rights at the national, regional, and international scales. And we're already beginning to see this. And this is actually where my optimism kicks in. We're seeing people, including children and youth, including Indigenous people, using their human rights to hold governments accountable. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. In the Netherlands, there was a decision last year from the Supreme Court of the Netherlands holding that the government had violated rights under the European Convention on Human Rights, the rights of Dutch citizens, by failing to take sufficiently ambitious action to address climate change. And the court ordered the government to make deeper, faster reductions. And the government, of course, is complying with the court's order, is in the process of closing down a coal-fired power plant that was built just a few years ago, reducing speed limits, and taking a whole range of actions to reduce emissions. In Colombia, a group of 25 children and youth filed a lawsuit arguing that deforestation in the Colombian portion of the Amazon rainforest is a violation of their rights to water, their rights to a healthy environment, their rights to culture. And again, the Supreme Court of Columbia agreed with those young people and ordered the government to sit down with those youths and scientists and come up with a plan to end deforestation in the very short term. There's a case currently before the UN Human Rights Committee brought by the Torres Strait Islanders versus Australia. And these indigenous people have lived for thousands of years on these islands off the coast of Australia and are making the case that their rights to life, health, and culture are being violated by Australia's inadequate activities on both mitigating climate change and adapting to climate change. Another factor which I think is tremendously important and encouraging is the emergence of a relatively new human right, the right to live in a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This is a right that was first recognized in the constitutions of Portugal and Spain in 1976 and 1978, but is now recognized by over 80% of the UN's member states. It's not yet recognized by the United Nations, however, and I believe it is a right which belongs to everyone, everywhere. And again, people are using their right to a healthy environment in cases around the world to argue that governments must take action. I just recently submitted an amicus brief in a case in Brazil where the Brazilian Supreme Court is poised to make a decision on whether Brazil's actions in not addressing the climate crisis violate the constitutional right to a healthy environment. And as Karima's report makes clear, and as she indicated in her remarks today, culture is part of the solution. The incredible wisdom of indigenous societies, their customary laws, the way they have managed the environment for thousands of years, very powerful in addressing the climate crisis. In Bhutan, reverence for and respect for forests led Bhutan to include a provision in their constitution that requires 60% of Bhutan to be permanently, in perpetuity, maintained in forests, which of course are the lungs of the earth and which are sinks for carbon dioxide emissions. And most recently, we just heard a report last week from the International Energy Agency saying that in most, solar is now the cheapest way to generate electricity, cheaper than fossil fuels, cheaper than coal, cheaper than natural gas. So I want to leave people with that note of optimism and reiterate my gratitude to Karima for highlighting the critical relationship between climate change, culture, and human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boyd. What an illuminating presentation with all the examples you gave, and then the reasons for having some optimism, what culture can provide in terms of solutions. Very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Joshua Casalino. He's the Executive Director of the Minority Rights Group International. He founded the School of Law at Middlesex University in London and served as its dean for many years. He retains his chair there while acting as Executive Director of Minority Rights Group International. He began his career as a journalist in Mumbai, India, which is where he was born and brought up. Mr. Casalino, welcome, and we look forward to your remarks. You have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Faria. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here with you today and to participate in what is really a celebration and a call to action. Culture has played a major role in getting us to what can only be described as our broken present. Today, in every part of the world, it seems we have governments stocked with people who know how to win elections, but not how to govern. They flounder in the face of real challenge, have no idea how to keep their population safe from the virus, refusing to learn from others who have succeeded. They think climate change is a question of opinion, not fact. And even those who accept it merely educate themselves to find strong rhetoric to forestall action. Crucially, these individuals have no idea how to stimulate their economies and create decent, dignified work in high enough volumes in the face of increased mechanization. Instead, they engage in a politics of mass distraction, finding effective ways to divide populations, to win popularity contests based on how shocking and venomous their speech can be when received by angry, disenfranchised masses. The world has seen incompetent governance before, with the best transitions coming when incumbents, faced with incontrovertible evidence of their failure, simply step aside. This is unlikely to happen since a facet of the current incompetence is a keenness to maintain power, assisted by an ability to see facts of failure as mere arguments to be suppressed, denied, repelled, or falsified. But panelists, colleagues, participants, This has not come to pass by accident, but through a series of conscious decisions and plans made by some, tacitly accepted by others who ought to have known better, blindly accepted by still others who read headlines. There have been objections, many vehement, but the objectors have been silenced, discredited, or even killed. I am, of course, referring to the world's indigenous peoples and ancient cultures that form the backdrop to human civilization, which has been trampled in the journey from then to now. There is a clear nexus between colonization and climate change. Despite the existence of clear tenets of recognized international law designed and articulated in Europe, Europeans saw the rest of the world as unoccupied, justifying expansion to vast lands, giving themselves right to take ownership of resources while subjugating peoples. Europeans were not the first colonizers, and as modern world economy shows, others who have had a hands-on economic power have sustained the argument that this is not the exclusive preserve of a few white communities from the pages of history. Rather, the culture of racial superiority remains central, enabling some to see others as backward, with that justifying their dispossession through trickery and ruthlessness, using force and spurious property laws. Ancient cultures and indigenous peoples were viewed as objects, not subjects of law, as less human, less deserving, whose resources and ways of life could be subjugated by conquerors who stole and took by force, justifying these narratives in their own literatures and cultures as good overcoming evil or as human overcoming savage. If you think I'm talking about ancient history, a short metaphorical tour through the world's existing statues will show exactly what it is that human beings have put quite literally on a pedestal. A swift journey through global history equally will reveal how it is the winning of brutal wars that dominate national histories more than the advances in humanity, science, and culture. There is little understanding even today that what is venerated as return on investment, reward for risk, return to capital, are actually based on a failure to properly account for other people's goods, services, work, and resources. Our global supply chains still only start gaining value once goods enter the jurisdiction of countries that form part of the OECD. While there have been echoes of inequality throughout, there has been this belief that it's only cumulative growth is the only way to combat it, on the baseless theory of trickle-down economics that fails to realize that wealth is viscous and will not trickle anywhere. This view, of course, is completely at odds with a vast array of indigenous and ancient cultures that have survived various periods of darkness, many of whom face existential threats today. Many of these cultures believe that property could not be owned, at least not individually, and even then, not exclusively or not for perpetuity. They venerated the idea that resources around their societies were there to be shared, with humanity merely a part of a much larger whole. And the survival would be gained through collaboration and harmony with others. They believe resources could be utilized, but only in a manner that will allow regeneration. To many, in every part of the world, the culture of stimulating demand where none existed, of selling goods and services that none had needed or imagined, and that the generation of those goods and services at large-scale profit was an anathema to all that was sacred. To these cultures, the idea of mass-producing goods that could be built just as easily to last, but were actively built instead to perish in a bid to ensure sustained demand over time to generate profit for the few seems absurd. Many indigenous communities have, of course, had no choice but to accept as their lands, lifestyles, cultures, languages, and even values have been swept away in a maelstrom of domination of a monocultural drive towards profit for a few. But what is most egregious now, and that's the principal focus of my intervention today, is the idea that the environment has suddenly become important to that other worldview, and that the perpetrators of this other worldview have decided that their science, often developed in active nexus with profit-making ventures, are the only ones who can come up with the mitigation of the problem of their own making. It is worth remembering that indigenous peoples have been at the very forefront of the call for environmental protection. They have lamented these quests for profit, have been forced to sacrifice their communities, lifestyles, and lives for the idea of protecting the environment. Many have maintained their cultures. Nearly all have maintained their know-how on how to live sustainably with nature. This despite the harassment, intimidation, incarceration, transplantation, and eviction, often to live on the margins as unskilled or semi-skilled workers in the outer reaches of peri-urban or urban population centers. One idea that has been gaining traction is that of having protected areas. The logic of this is clear. Human devastation of nature is of such a magnitude that the only way in which the planet can regenerate is if some parts are protected from human activity. The idea is that this will facilitate biodiversity protection, allowing flora and fauna to flourish while offsetting human activity elsewhere, moving us closer to planetary boundaries. It sounds like a reasonable proposition. And in these times of heightened environmental crisis, it actually signals action rather than rhetoric. But please examine it closer, because it is worth examining closer. These protected areas are going to be located in territories currently populated almost exclusively by indigenous peoples. These areas are attractive as protected areas because they still have their biodiversity intact. But guess what? They still have their biodiversity intact because indigenous communities acted as their guardians. Having protected areas that will displace indigenous peoples is a continued violation of their rights, but it is actually worse than that. It is nearly a cent% guarantee that the removal of the custodians of the forests from those areas, placing them instead at the behest of the state, would be a disaster for the perspective of environmental protection. It will not take a lot of research skills for any of you who have yet to engage with this issue to discover the relative track records of state forestry services compared to that of indigenous custodians. This travesty is accompanied by the belief that Western science will come up with a solution for how to mitigate climate change that pays scant attention to traditional knowledge. The fires that ravaged in Australia at the start of this year were a case in point. Aboriginal cultures had long resorted to using small bushfires deemed scientifically unsafe, environmentally hazardous. With the practice banned, forest debris accumulated on the forest floor and small sparks simply devastated a massive part of the country, killing flora and fauna. Aboriginal cultures knew and understood the risk, but their way of life was dismissed with dire consequences. This widespread denigration of cultures, in conjunction with absolute beliefs in the superiority of Western science, is deeply troubling for its lack of effectiveness, as well as its dubious morality. Worse, however, it means that indigenous peoples will once again be sacrificed as mere collateral to ensure that the big cities that keep spewing out carbon dioxide can continue relatively unmolested. Who gets to decide who acts as collateral for who? What happened to the polluter pays principle? Why do cultures whose carbon footprint is zero have to pay the price for other cultures? If you think this echoes colonial practice, it's because it does. Protected areas were used by colonial rulers in Africa and Asia to reserve exclusive game hunting zones for themselves. Indigenous peoples were then seen as objects in much the way that animals or trees were, not subjects with the ability to reason, make decisions, and actually contribute to global issues. Yet there has been a growing consensus that protected areas today are vital and necessary, with little evidence they would work. I want to conclude by calling for 5 specific actions that are needed, that in some shape or form implicate and include every one of us on this session. First, dealing with the past. And this is in line with what hashtag Black Lives Matter is calling for. De-venerating those heroes and telling the story right, because that is important. Second, pricing and paying for the accumulative profits amassed by the longest, most trusted corporate entities whose wealth has been built from this devastation. In the past, reparations were tried against states, but that's difficult because states necessarily also have other populations that are victims. Corporations do not. Third, and this is very important, recognizing the existing ancestral domain and native title of Aboriginal communities. And fourth, as a consequence, mainstreaming and prioritizing those Indigenous voices in this climate debate. Finally, admitting wrongdoing, listening actively, and committing to change is the only way in which we can move forward. As Professor Benoon says in her report and said very articulately today, this is about choices and changes. And this is about people, about the planet, and not about the profit. I urge you to take the actions and to really support this move to bring us back from the precipice of the climate abyss that we are on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Castellino. Such important information about some of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change on culture, but also ending with some action items. Just the ticket. Thank you so much. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, another frontline defender. We opened with a frontline defender, and we now hear from another frontline defender, Noah Tapumanaia. He's the Chief Librarian and Archivist in the Tuvalu National Library and Archives Department and the National Librarian of Tuvalu. And the Special Rapporteur met him while on mission in his country, and we're very, very pleased indeed. He had to get up at something like 5 in the morning in order to participate in this panel. So welcome, welcome. You have the floor.
Hey, thank you very much, Stephanie. I would also like to thank Karima for inviting me to become to be in this discussion, this conference. I would also like to acknowledge the previous speakers, David and Joshua, with such a strong voice of how we're going to address the issue of climate change. As a first-hand witness of what is going on here in Tuvalu, I would like to stress these four main issues that is really happening here in Tuvalu, in the context of library and archives. And also, I think it's also relevant to all Pacific archives and library. The first one is our identity, our culture, our memories, and the fourth one is our heritage. These words are strongly stressed in the report that Karima worked on, and the report really impacted or really touched me personally as a Tuvaluan, that of how the importance of the addressing of climate change. We all know that climate change is not a new thing to people like us here in Tuvalu. We've been growing up facing it, taking pieces by pieces of our identity. If we're speaking about rights, human rights, then we people of Tuvalu, we have the right to our identity as well. We can't sit or sleep while climate change is taking away our identity. But we can't do much because we don't have the capability to combat it in terms of financially. For our culture, why we are taking the blame of losing our culture if something that we don't have, we have nothing to do about it, which is climate change. What we think about the memories of our people who have passed on, that we need to tell our children and their children of how life of a Tuvaluan has become. And what about our heritage? Do we have to just live without them? These are the main questions that we need to address in a high-level dialogue. That sometimes people are so stubborn to realize that what is happening to Tuvalu is real, and in order to save us, it will not only save the people of Tuvalu, but it will save the whole world as well. So, listening this morning, I have to get up very early this morning to come and be part of this conference. And listening to the previous speakers motivate myself, because most of the time there is a feeling of becoming, giving up, just because of we have nothing to do in order to support our claim that climate change is really taking away our identity and our culture and our memories. and also our heritage. Most of the people, I believe, in the world, that they turn a blind eye to the situation happening here in Tuvalu. But for a person like Karima already been here, she knows what's really happening, and what we have been discussed of how we're going to save the Tuvalu collection. These collections really matter to the people of Tuvalu. That it is the only first-hand witness of how the transition of administration through people of Tuvalu during the time of colonial days, where the British colonized Tuvalu. My thoughts and prayers that the report will be heard when Karima tabled it, and our duty as citizens and people of the world, we need to tell our leaders about the impact of this climate change. It's not that we want things to be put in place, but we want people to have the rights that God gave them to live in their country. Because when we are born in our country and we live in our country, and we expect we have to die in our country and not in other people's country. Because it is a very sad situation for someone to be relocated to someone else's country just because of actions of some people that are so naive, who cannot hurt people like us, Tuvalu, facing the real impact of the climate change. If our ancestors brought up here what they built for us, we need to continue so that our children can see what our culture, our memories, and our heritage speaking to them to become real Tuvalu. And we do not want to be labeled as partially Tuvalu, only 2%. We want to be 100% Tuvalu. I think that's all I have to say for this time. And I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity so I can raise my concern and my support for the report written by Karima. And thank you very much, Stephanie, for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Just really so brings home the real true impacts of climate change on culture and cultural life. We will now, in just a second, turn to our question and answer period. I just wanted to answer for everyone watching a question that someone posed, which is about the recordings. So just to reiterate, the recording of this webinar will be posted on the Roosevelt House website and will also be posted on Special Rapporteur Karima Benoon's website. And I wanted to send around to everyone the link to, if I can manage this, the link to her reports. And also, let me go to the, if you want to sign up for the Special Rapporteur's mailing list as well, because some of you may wish to continue with some of these discussions and learn more. There is the site you can send an email to get on the mailing list of the Special Rapporteur. So I have some questions here, and I'd like to pose the first question, if I may, to Mary Robinson. Based on your wide global experience, what would you say are the biggest global obstacles from your vantage point to addressing the issues that we've been discussing today?
It's been a great discussion, first of all, and the biggest global obstacles are the failures of governments and business to take seriously the climate crisis. We may be seeing a sort of change. It was important that China announced that it would be net zero by 2060. Okay, it's important that the European Union increased its ambition from reducing emissions by 40% by 2030 to at least 55%. We await, hopefully, a change in the United States. I don't know, but we can hope. And that the United States will take its responsibility, because this is what it's about. Unless, and then business all over the world. And that point that David made about, fossil fuels still being so dominant is terrible. It's destroying us. And, we do need this people-centered approach. I think COVID will help us. We've all been sort of taken out of our comfort zone. COVID has not been a great equalizer, not at all. It has exacerbated the inequalities, exacerbated the impacts, and also brought out the intersectionality. And I want to repeat a little of what was said about Black Lives Matter. We see now the connections between Black Lives Matter, between gender inequality, between the Me Too movement, between the climate, Fridays for Future. All of these movements should be connecting more, because we are all addressing the same issues, and we need to have a bottom-up pressure to increase the willingness of those with power to change in the way that the climate crisis requires. And COVID has taught us, and if I can just very briefly say the lessons of COVID. First of all, that human behavior collectively matters. Now we know that we collectively are the only thing between us and the vaccine in countries. And the better we are at complying with what we're told to do, the more we will suppress the virus. Afterwards, we have to be the same, especially in the rich world, if I can call it that, the industrialized world. We have to change, and we have to become better consumers, less waste, change our diet, etc., etc. Circular economy, no fossil fuel, etc. Secondly, government matters. We see that governments perform well or not, and will be called out on that. Thirdly, science matters. We have to listen to the scientists, as the children tell us to. And fourthly, compassion matters. And that's what I want to really bring out, because as chair of the elders, we have to bring hope. It is good to see the way in which people are more open to the other now. And we need that. We need that empathy and that solidarity and that leaving no one behind, and that really caring about voices from the Maldives and Tuvalu, as we've heard so eloquently today.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pose a question for Noah Tapumanaia. As a frontline defender of culture and cultural rights, what kind of support do those that are doing that work around the world, what do the frontline defenders need the most from the international community and allies elsewhere? So Noah Tapumanaia, if you could answer that question about what might be most useful to you as a frontline defender.
Yeah, I think the most useful thing is to provide to document what we have now, and to safeguard them before climate change reaches us. For a place like us here in Tuvalu, we need physical strong storage, so that we can save what we have now for the future. That is my response from here, Stephanie.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question about the issue of extraterritoriality, we go to state responsibility and what can we hold them responsible for? What are they responsible for? And perhaps Dr. Boyd, if you would address some of the many issues that arise from issues of extraterritoriality, and maybe even getting around those older traditional approaches to that issue in order to really, really address climate change.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, and great question. And I would love to actually hear from Karima on this as well. You know, extraterritoriality in the context of climate change has been a huge problem, obviously. I'm involved in a lawsuit in Norway where a group of young people and Greenpeace filed a lawsuit against the government of Norway, arguing that Norway's decision to permit additional exploration for fossil fuels off the Norwegian coast, the legal argument is that's a violation of their constitutional right to a healthy environment. And at the trial level in Norway, the court held that there was no violation of the constitutional right to a healthy environment because the oil and gas that will be found and produced will be exported and combusted or burned in other countries, which is such a catastrophic conclusion from a scientific perspective. You know, climate change is a global issue. It doesn't matter where fossil fuels are burned, they exacerbate the climate crisis. And so fortunately that particular finding was overturned on appeal. But the question of how we grapple with the impacts of one country on the human rights of people in another country is something that we are really at a very early stage of dealing with, I have to say. You know, the kind of bedrock of international law is this concept of state sovereignty, that states are solely responsible for deciding what happens within their boundaries. And I think that we need to recognize that that fundamental principle of international law needs to evolve to reflect contemporary circumstances and the climate challenge. I do see hope in the growing movement, which was pioneered by France, but is now spreading across the European Union, passing laws, due diligence laws, which require businesses to carry out due diligence, not only in their activities in their home state, so in the French example, within France, but within any other country where they are operating, right through the entire supply chain. And so that's a potentially promising development that will begin to address at least corporate responsibility for their impacts in other countries. But the reality is we have a long ways to go.
Thank you so much indeed. And I think we can take some inspiration from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights advisory opinion on the environment and human rights from a couple of years ago that hopefully the rest of the world will follow. I'd also like to call on Professor Ben-Nun to address the extraterritoriality question as well.
Thank you very much. So first of all, thanks to all of the speakers for your very inspiring words, and thanks to the person who submitted this critical question about the extraterritoriality of the human rights obligations related to climate change. I actually addressed this in the annex to the report. Unfortunately, the entire international legal framework section ended up in the annex for reasons of the word limit, which of course for me as a professor of international law was somewhat painful, but these reports can only be 10,700 words long. But in the annex, you will find a number of paragraphs that address this, including paragraph 33, where I talk about the jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice, which has recognized the state obligation to prevent significant transboundary environmental harm as part of customary international law. And I also mention, as Professor Ferrier just noted, that a state's extraterritorial human rights obligations entail the obligation to exercise due diligence to ensure that its activities and those of actors over whom a state exercises authority or effective control do not cause foreseeable environmental harm that infringes on the human rights of persons and groups outside of its territorial boundaries. And this is drawing from the Inter-American Court and also from a very important expert brief that Professor Ferrier submitted in that case. There's also a related discussion here in the annex, if I just might add, on sovereignty and the need to think about what sovereignty means in the face of climate change. So sovereignty is a sort of core a provision in the UN Charter, but obviously we have to think about its relationship to culture, to territory, to boundaries, and to rights in the context of climate change. And in fact, these sort of transboundary activities that states are engaging in are really infringing on the sovereignty of other states. And one of the points that I make with regard to countries like Tuvalu, and I hope this won't be the case, but is that if in particular small island states or parts of territory are inundated due to sea level rise, or they become inaccessible or submerged due to climate change, that they should retain their sovereignty nonetheless and its related benefits, such as fishing rights and rights concerning underwater cultural heritage. I think this is absolutely critical, and I hope that it doesn't come to that. But if it does, I do think that we really need to think about this issue transnationally and in a new creative way that perhaps finds answers that we didn't have in classical human rights approaches. But this is, I'm afraid, not a classical challenge we face. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bruno. Yeah, I think among the many key contributions of this report is calling attention to the fact that climate change actually infringes on the sovereignty of the states that are being so devastatingly impacted. So a question for Joshua Castellino. From your perspective and your experience, what are the roles of cultural rights defenders in addressing these challenges, and what from your experience do you see as the support that they need?
Well, they've got a wonderful special rapporteur, that helps. No, I think it is important that culture is acknowledged as being far wider than we've credited it with. So there has been this, even when you look at the way in which international human rights law has treated this, there were the civil rights, the political rights, the economic, social, and oh yes, there was a cultural right, and culture was almost ignored. And I think that's to our peril, really, because so much of what we do and so much of where we've got to is about our culture. And that raising of the voice and the profile of cultural human rights defenders has been crucial. And that's what Karina did in her first report. And I think this one builds on that quite significantly. And I think that is important, the solidarity, partly because many of the cultural industries that we think of tend to be the more progressive ones anyway, are more likely to engage with the kinds of themes that require serious revisiting. They very often take on stories of power and take on stories of truth-telling to power. So I think that's an important ally in the general human rights fight. And those are people who are really at the forefront of trying to change the mindset. I think you would get that from what Mrs. Mary Robinson said, what all the panelists have said. This is about a mindset shift. And there is an opportunity now to really move towards that mindset shift. And cultural human rights defenders play a key role. If I may also add a word on the extraterritoriality issue, part of this is also a fight that we are involved in, and certainly civil society is at the front of it, to gain accountability. And to gain accountability right from the start of a good or a product in an indigenous territory, all the way to a table or a hall where it might appear in a Western developed country. And I think trying to understand exactly how we can seek accountability for that is civil society's answer to how to make this and ensure that the transnational nature of this is not ignored in any attempts to solve them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Got quite a few questions here. So let me pull up another one. Here, someone has commented that a number of the solutions being proposed by affluent states seem to be based on the same tools and logic that caused the problem in the first place, the carbon markets and geoengineering and so forth. And I actually am going to open this up to whomever wishes to respond to this. How do we bring this culture to the forefront of the climate debates and get away from the solutions that seem so based on the approaches that the more affluent states understand without attempting to understand perhaps other solutions? So I'll throw that one out. This might be like class where sometimes there is reticence to answer, but I hope someone will. How do we get away from or have more solutions that are not solely based on the affluent countries?
Well, I'll jump in
David.
there,
Yes,
Stephanie,
thank
before
you.
you have to point your finger at somebody. Yeah, this is a critical point, and this really highlights the importance of taking a rights-based approach to all aspects of climate change, whether it's preventing the impacts of climate change upon human rights, but also in terms of the so-called solutions. We have to avoid false solutions. Someone else in the questions and answers has raised the issue of hydroelectric projects. We can't have hydroelectric projects that displace thousands or tens of thousands of people from indigenous and other local types of communities. That's not a solution, although the reality is that hydroelectric projects may produce low carbon electricity. That's not a solution. We need to find solutions that respect the entire spectrum of human rights. And some of these other solutions that are being proposed, one of the most controversial is called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which would basically mean taking land that's currently being used to produce food and using that land to produce fiber that could be combusted and then regrown with additional crops. That's the carbon capture and storage part of it. That's a terrible threat to food security, the right to food. That's a threat to biodiversity. It's a threat to the forests that indigenous peoples depend on. So yeah, just to go back to my initial point, we need to take a rights-based approach that ensures respect for all human rights, and particularly the right to culture when we talk about climate solutions.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think Mrs. Robinson, you were going to weigh in on that as well.
I think David did a very good job on it. I was kind of going to make a point about how we need to have solutions that are benefiting from traditional wisdom, the wisdom of indigenous peoples, the wisdom, and this point was made earlier. You know, I have learned so much from a webinar that I have at the moment, or sorry, not a podcast that I have at the moment, called Mothers of Invention, where we listen to women from the South, indigenous women, young women, about solutions that are about saving the seeds, about saving the forests. All of these approaches that we need to understand and really try and amplify and bring to the so-called powerful places, because basically, if we'd only listen, we would understand how to save our forests, how to save the lungs of the world, how to save, we don't need this geoengineering technical. We do need, I think we will need, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think we will need to capture more carbon ultimately in order to be at zero carbon thing. But my sense is, there is such wisdom there. There is such smart agriculture projects there. There is some rewilding, so much that I've learned in the last few years of how we can do much better. If the closer we are to nature, the better we will do.
Thank you so much for that intervention. We have another question. And it's interesting. I think a lot of the questions being posed now circle around the same issues, which is how do we actually bring about change? And how can we, here's one that, how can we ensure that mitigation adaptation strategies respect human rights? There's a recommendation for rights-based mitigation and adaptation strategies, the questioner mentions. And the current Article 6 negotiations to establish a new global carbon market under the Paris Agreement hardly mentions enshrining human rights obligations within the mechanism. And so it does seem to circle back to once again, the effectiveness of ensuring, how can we truly ensure mitigation adaptation strategies respect human rights? And I don't know if someone wanted to add to what has been suggested before, other than more activism. But if anyone wanted to weigh in on that specific question, ways to ensure that mitigation adaptation strategies respect human rights. Yes, Mrs. Robinson.
The only reason I'm coming back in is
Yes.
this was the message of my Foundation for Climate Justice.
Yes.
Before Paris, and then in the couple of years after Paris. And our strategy was to get champions of countries, because that's how you move the agenda. It has to be ambassadors, but even well below ministers, ambassadors, and then well below that, the climate negotiators. They have to understand human rights. They have to be instructed in it. And I would say to our excellent human rights collaborators, Karima and David and others, spend more time with climate negotiators. Spend more time with them. Somehow get into a close dialogue with them, because they have to champion your perspective when it comes to what's happening in the negotiations, for example, towards COP26 in Glasgow. If my climate foundation was still there, we would be encouraging these climate. The reason that we felt we could, declare ourselves redundant, which we did, was that we had climate negotiators on gender and human rights. Probably not enough, but at least they were there. That's what is needed. We have to change the language that the climate negotiators use in the very discussions that they have. And I think that the UN special rapporteurs on all of the issues that David noted, where they're excellent on exactly what we need to do, need to get out of their comfort zone and go and negotiate some kind of dialogue with the very climate negotiators who are negotiating the COP and the ambition of that COP.
Thank you. And I see we have
I'll stay in with you, so you can disagree with me if you wish.
So Dr. Boyd and then Professor Pannun. Dr. Boyd.
Well, first of all, thank you for that terrific advice, Mary Robinson, and I will definitely take heed of that and try to do that. But I also think that human rights has not really penetrated the climate change conversation to the extent that it needs to. I mean, which is,
that's
shocking.
That's what we were trying to do. Yeah, that's what we were trying to do, and that has to continue. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. But we need to do tangible, practical things. So, all of the countries of the world have to submit new nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. Efforts have to take place at every level to have human rights incorporated into the heart of those NDCs. In the first round, only 24 out of 169 even mentioned the word human rights.
Yeah.
And then we also have to point to examples of success. And I'll just highlight two Latin American countries, Costa Rica and Uruguay, where in those countries, they understand at a very fundamental level the connection between climate change and human rights and culture. And in Uruguay, they did this by combining, it wasn't just the Ministry of Environment that was responsible for climate change. They took the human rights apparatus of government and they made them get together. So the human rights apparatus and the climate change and environmental apparatus. And so Uruguay has a climate change action plan that is firmly rooted in human rights. And I think that's a tremendous example for the world. Thank you.
Karima?
I just wanted to add a quick word. I think this point about the need for climate action to be rights respecting is so important, and we need to make sure that that includes respectful of cultural rights, which often get forgotten. We need to make sure that there are impact assessments done that include culture and cultural rights. But I think we also have to be very nuanced and recognize that not all cultural objections to mitigation and adaptation are sort of justified. And climate action should shouldn't always give way in the face of them. And indeed, I want to be very careful how I say this because it's also abused, but cultural rights, like many other human rights, are subject to limitations if those limitations are rights respecting, and especially if they're based on consultation and participation. And the reality is, to kick our addiction to fossil fuels, we may have to change cultural aspects related to the automobile. The automobile is very cultural. I can tell you this is certainly the case in places like Michigan in the United States, but many other places. And so there is cultural change that we're going to have to make. The report addresses this, paragraphs 57 to 62. This requires a commitment to effective climate change, climate action, excuse me, but also a sensitive human rights approach to dialogue with all the stakeholders, to education to shift mindsets, to documentation of any sort of necessary heritage losses. And again, I stress the participation and engagement with effective populations. But thanks to everybody for all these great questions.
Okay, and I wanted to, Joshua Castellino, you had turned your video on. Would you like to share some thoughts as well on that?
Yeah, I mean, far be it for me to disagree with such an erudite panel, of course. It's not a disagreement. It's probably an and yes, please, but. It's a slight note of dissonance, I guess. There is absolutely right when Mary Robinson says that the special rapporteurs have a key role to play in being the interlocutors for human rights with the climate lobby. But there are two elements there I would really stress. And I think, in a sense, this particular panel and Karina's report, and actually David's work as well, are already testament to this. They have to listen to the communities. I think these particular special rapporteurs do, and they, in a sense, don't present themselves as authoritative figures based on their knowledge. They reflect the existing communities that they work with. That is a key facet, because what you have had before are people who are interlocutors, and those interlocutors don't seem to be able to get away from their own mindset in negotiating. And then you have the white savior complex again in that particular process. So we need to make sure we connect with the movements. And this is what Mary Robinson said earlier, and how Black Lives Matter, all of these movements, in a sense, they come into one. And that's the negotiation that has to take place. And I often think about it in kind of colonial terms as the quest between profiteers and progressivists. You know, this is what has driven colonialism. We might think that certainly one narrative is that colonization gave us the rule of law and democracy and Enlightenment values. The other narrative that I presented is that colonialism took away resources and destroyed and devastated communities. Now, there's an element of both there. We tend to focus on one side of that narrative, depending on our perspective. And then when we do present the other side, we do it as interlocutors. We don't need to do that anymore. We can connect directly to movements. We need to connect directly to movements. And the wonderful thing about this advice, which is why I agree with it, and that's why I said I wouldn't disagree with an erudite panel, least of all when it says something I agree with. In this particular context, absolutely. It makes sense for interlocutors like David and Karina to be engaging more with climate negotiators, because they are backed by a volume of evidence from listening to communities that they can put at the behest of people who are not in the habit of listening to communities.
Thank you so much for fabulous interventions by everyone. We are coming to the end of our time. And just as we opened the event with remarks by the co-host, executive director of the Human Rights Program at Roosevelt House, to close out the event, I turn the floor back to the other co-host, Special Rapporteur Benoon. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. I just, before I conclude, want to mention two particular recommendations that I hope get significant consideration going forward. One is to ensure adequate funding for all programs and policies at the intersection of climate, culture, and human rights. This work cannot be done, it cannot be continued and grow without resources, including material resources. And another is to ensure science-based climate change education incorporating a cultural rights perspective, so that includes also traditional knowledge for all. And in the annex to the report, I express my grave concerns about climate denial, which is really a sponsored narrative that is gravely undermining our ability to protect our cultures from climate change. Thank you so much to all of you for remaining on. And it's especially wonderful because I know we're all spending so much time on Zoom at the moment. I know that this is a testament both to the importance of the subject matter and also to the brilliance of our speakers. And I really thank all of the speakers again so much for their inspiring words from which we have really learned and benefited. And I thank our expert moderator. Can I ask that you all please consider sharing the recording of this event, which will be made available so that these messages continue to travel? And I thank Roosevelt House again, both for making that recording available, but also for hosting and making possible this event. In closing, I return to some of the themes I started with. I would ask each of us to imagine the cultural site or cultural practice most precious to us wiped out by climate change, gone, because that is indeed a possibility. I would ask us all to consider the prospect of losing nearly all of our people's cultural achievements, because many today in the world face such stark realities. Then we also have to think about what it would mean to know that this is happening due to poor choices, sometimes made far away, about which one was never consulted, and owing to the abject failures of governments, corporations, and our fellow human beings to act when they knew very well that these would be the outcomes. That is what we have to contemplate. That is what must spur us all to become or to continue to be climate culture advocates going forward from this event, which is not the end, but the beginning, I hope, of our work together. We have to also support all of those who are already doing this work, often with limited resources around the world. And I think it's this advocacy and collaboration that can give us hope. And an Afghan woman once told me, optimism is key to survival. I think that's absolutely true in these times. But today, optimism can only be sustained by facing reality and actively organizing for better climate culture outcomes. So let's go forward from this event in these times in vigilance, action, and hope. And to the many students who are watching, let me say that for all of this, we count on your emerging leadership to help guide us to better approaches. It's really hard to think of what I can say that others have not already said to convince the international community to take action while action is still possible to save ourselves, our rights, and our cultures. The report's conclusion suggests that perhaps there is only one word to add, borrowing from children's author Dr. Seuss and from a story I grew up with. This is the word that Seuss's mythical creature, the Lorax, left for a child, along with the last remaining seed for a disappearing tree in his environmentally degraded world. That word is unless. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And that concludes the program.